Before the collision, the world that did not yet know what it was about to lose. Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we will not speak about the history that was, but about the history that almost came to be. A history that does not appear in textbooks, not because it was impossible, but because it was stopped before it could crystallize. A history sustained by real decisions, real maps, and men who existed and thought beyond their own time. This is the story of how the world could have changed when the greatest power of antiquity decided to look beyond Greece and fixed its gaze on a city that did not yet know it was destined to rule the world. Now, let us begin. Before Rome was marble, before its legions set the rhythm of the world, before its language became law, Rome was a rough city. Not beautiful, not refined, not universal. A city built with urgency rather than vision, spread across uneven hills, on the banks of a slow, brown river that impressed no one. The Tiber was not the Nile. It was not the Euphrates. It was not a sacred river. It was simply useful. Rome grew not because it was special, but because it was stubborn. At this point in history, Rome was not an empire. It was not even an undisputed regional power. It was a young republic, marked by internal conflict, by class struggle, by a persistent fear of falling once again under a king. The expulsion of the monarchy was still fresh in collective memory. Shared power was not a moral virtue. It was a defense mechanism. Rome distrusted concentrated power because it had suffered under it. Every free citizen was also a soldier, not for glory, but out of necessity. War was not a profession. It was an extension of agriculture. They fought in spring, they harvested in autumn. They survived as best they could. And yet, year after year, Rome advanced. Not all at once, not through great conquests. It advanced the way roots do, silent, persistent. While Rome fought neighbors it knew by name, at the other end of the known world, there existed something Rome could not imagine. Not a city, not a league, not a confederation. A system, an empire so vast that the sun rose and set without ever leaving its domains. An empire where distance was not an obstacle, but a calculated variable. That empire was Persia. Persia resembled nothing that had existed before. It was not merely large, it was organized. Where other kingdoms conquered and destroyed, Persia conquered and cataloged cities, peoples, languages, gods. Everything had a place. It did not demand cultural conversion, it demanded stability. As long as taxes flowed and order was maintained, the empire did not interfere. That was its greatest strength and its greatest threat to any emerging power. The Persian throne was not merely a golden seat. It was the apex of a machine. Satrapies, scribes, inspectors, imperial couriers. Orders did not travel by rumor. They traveled along routes designed for that purpose. A message could cross thousands of kilometers, faster than any enemy army. Power did not reside solely in the sword, but in the record. When Xerxes inherited the crown, he did not inherit territory alone. He inherited memory. The memory of rebellions, the memory of betrayals, the memory of small peoples who, ignored for too long, had become threats. Xerxes was not impulsive. He was an heir to systems, and systems think in the long term. Traditional history tells us that Xerxes marched against Greece, driven by pride and vengeance. That is true, but it is incomplete. Great conflicts rarely have a single cause. Behind pride, there was calculation. Behind vengeance, there was prevention. Kings do not think only of the present. They think of what will come when they are no longer there. To correct mistakes, Xerxes looked at Greece and saw resistance. But when he looked beyond, he saw something else. He saw potential. Reports arrived from the west, not from Athens, not from Sparta, from farther away, from Italy. Imperial scribes did not speak in epic terms. They spoke in patterns, They described a city without a king, a republic where power was fragmented, yet military discipline endured, a society where war was not a political choice, but a civic obligation. That was new. That was dangerous. Rome was not strong, not yet, but it was persistent. And in history, persistence overcomes strength. More often than we like to admit, Rome did not settle for surviving. It advanced. A valley today, a hill tomorrow, an ally turned subordinate the following year. It did not ask permission. It did not negotiate from weakness. It simply continued. The Mediterranean of the 5th century BCE was not a Roman sea. It was a board. Phoenicians, Greeks, Etruscans, Carthaginians, Egyptians, each port was a piece, each alliance a move, and Persia already had hands on that board. It did not need to cross unknown seas. It did not need to improvise fleets. It had historical allies, friendly ports, trade routes that also served as military routes. The war would not begin with a battle. It would begin with agreements. Carthage watched Rome with growing concern. For generations, Carthage had dominated Western trade, not through land conquest, but through maritime control. Rome, slow but steady, was approaching that domain, not with fleets, with territory, and that was even more dangerous. When Persia sent envoys to Carthage, it did not speak of war. It spoke of balance, of containment, of stopping a force. Before it learned how to cross the sea, Rome had to be stopped before it became something impossible to stop. While Greece prepared to resist the East, the West did not know. It was being measured, weighed, evaluated, calculated. Xerxes did not raise his army for a single front. He divided it, one part visible, loud, destined to remain in human memory, and another silent part, destined to change history. Without witnesses, Rome began to hear rumors. Merchants spoke of strange ships in the south, of soldiers who did not loot, but paid, of officers who recorded roads, bridges, and granaries, as if they planned to stay. The Senate debated. Some laughed. Rome had survived Etruscans and Latins. Why fear a distant king? Because Rome did not yet understand that the greatest danger does not always arrive as a declared enemy. Asterisk, asterisk. The invisible war, asterisk, asterisk. Rome had always understood war as something close, a conflict with familiar names, with enemies who shared language, customs, even gods. War was personal, almost familial. They fought neighboring peoples, cities that could be pointed out on a small map, enemies who returned every spring until one side gave way. This time was different. There was no foreign king shouting challenges from a hill. There were no raids to inflame popular anger, no burned temples, no devastated fields. There was no recognizable war, only scattered facts, silent, difficult to assemble into a single story. Southern cities that stopped paying tribute to Rome, roads where messengers never returned, ports where flags changed without combat. Nothing looked like an invasion. Everything looked like coincidence. The Senate debated. While the world changed around it, the Roman Republic was still learning how to govern itself. Tensions between patricians and plebeians had not vanished. Agreements were fragile. Authority was temporary. Each consul ruled for a year. Each year brought new priorities. No one thought in decades. Persia did. The empire did not need speed. It had patience. It did not seek a quick victory. It sought an inevitable one. And for that, the first step was to understand Rome better than the Romans understood themselves. The first clashes were small, skirmishes on secondary roads, advanced guard encounters, engagements not worth speeches in the Senate. And in each of them, Rome gained something and lost something more important. It gained ground. It lost understanding. Roman soldiers fought bravely. That was never in doubt. But they did not understand the enemy. They did not understand why the Persians withdrew in an orderly fashion, why they never pursued partial victories, why every retreat seemed to lead them exactly where the enemy wanted. Rome was used to impulsive enemies, to armies that, once struck, lost cohesion. The Persian army did not break. It folded back, rotated, reappeared. Tired units were replaced. Officers did not improvise. Orders were not debated. Each battle was an experiment. Each clash, a measurement. Rome did not know it, but it was being studied. The true battle did not occur on an open field. It occurred far from shields and spears. It occurred in logistics. Rome depended on nearby farms, on familiar roads, on a local network that worked. As long as war stayed close to home, Persia depended on something else. Records, warehouses, routes planned years earlier, for conflicts that did not yet exist. When winter arrived, the Romans ran out of supplies. The Persians did not. Hunger does not kill immediately. It weakens, and a weakened army makes bad decisions. That was when the Senate made its first fatal mistake. It chose to escalate. A larger levy was called. All Italic allies were summoned. A decisive victory was promised. Rome did what it had always done when it felt cornered: march with everything. The encounter took place north of Latium on an open plain. The Romans considered favorable: wide terrain, no treacherous hills, ideal for traditional formation. There they deployed their classic structure: armed citizens, locked shields, absolute confidence. Rome was convinced that a frontal battle would solve the problem. The Persians waited. They did not attack first. They let Rome advance. They let fatigue do its work. When the battle began, it was not the clash that broke the Romans. It was the silence. There were no disordered shouts, no chaotic charge. There were clear orders, visual signals, a rhythm that did not change. The enemy seemed unhurried. Persian archers did not fire to kill. They fired to tire, to force shields up, to strain arms, to break breathing. Each arrow was a question without an answer. Then the cavalry entered, not to crush, not to pierce, to separate. Small gaps, split formations, units isolated without realizing it. Roman strength lay in cohesion, and that cohesion was being dismantled. With surgical precision, the Roman formation began to fragment, not from fear, by design. When they tried to regroup, it was already impossible. Commands could not be heard. Signals could not be understood. Each group fought its own battle. The enemy did not seek annihilation. It sought disorganization. And when Roman discipline was lost, the battle ended, without the need for a massacre. Rome was not destroyed that day. It was humiliated, and that was worse. The survivors returned with unsettling stories. They did not speak of brutality. They did not speak of cruelty. They spoke of efficiency. They said the Persians collected their wounded, that they respected temples, that they offered terms even after victory. That behavior unsettled Rome, because it did not fit its idea of war. In the months that followed, more Italian cities changed sides, not out of betrayal, out of convenience. Persia offered stability, Rome offered uncertainty, and small peoples choose survival before another's pride. The Senate began to fracture. Some demanded total resistance. Others proposed negotiation. But Rome did not know how to negotiate without appearing weak, and Persia knew exactly when to offer dialogue. Xerxes never set foot on the battlefield. He did not need to. From the east, he received detailed reports. He knew how many men Rome had, how many it could lose, how many allies were wavering. But he knew something even more important. Rome still believed it could win. The final blow was not military. It was political. Persia sent envoys directly to the Senate, not with threats, with proposals: local autonomy, imperial protection, commercial integration. Rome would remain Rome. It would simply stop deciding alone. Some senators understood the inevitable. Others shouted betrayal. The city froze. And while they debated, the world continued moving. When Rome formally rejected the terms, Persia did not respond with fury. It responded with closure. Trade blockade, diplomatic isolation, constant pressure. Rome began to suffocate without a single sack. That was when the unthinkable occurred. A Roman faction, influential patricians, weary generals, men who had seen enough, opened the gates. Not to the army, to the administration. There was no fire. There was no massacre. There were scribes. There were censuses. There were oaths. The Republic did not fall in a night. It dissolved over months. Rome became a province, not through total defeat, but through exhaustion. Asterisk, asterisk. The world that never was Rome. Asterisk, asterisk. Centuries passed without thunder. There was no fall to mark, no collapse to point at, because what never fully rose could not truly fall. The world kept turning, but without an absolute center. The Persian Empire, like all empires, changed. Dynasties followed one another, capitals shifted, borders adjusted again and again. But the Persian idea administer without erasing, outlived kings. Satrapies adapted. Italy remained valuable, not for conquest, for production, trade, and stability. Rome slowly ceased to be Rome, not in name, in spirit. The Republican memory did not disappear, but it lost political force. It became narrative, oral tradition, an old story that no longer dictated the present. Without Rome as a model, Western Europe took another path. Northern tribes found no definitive wall. There was no clear imperial frontier against which to define themselves. There was contact, exchange, small conflicts, but no total absorption. Europe grew fragmented. Without an early shared identity, without a dominant language, without a symbolic capital, cultures evolved more slowly, but more autonomously. Each region developed its own hierarchies, its own origin myths, its own forms of power. The very idea of the West took centuries to form, and when it did, it was not Roman. It was hybrid, Greek in thought, Persian in administration, local in custom. Writing followed different paths. Without Latin as an imperial language, there was no dominant linguistic inheritance. Languages evolved separately, more diverse, less standardized. Understanding between regions was slower, but no language could impose itself as definitive. The world was harder to govern, but also more resistant to total collapse. There was no single axis, whose fall would drag everyone down. Crises were regional, collapses partial. Knowledge did not concentrate, it dispersed. Religion followed the same pattern. Without imperial adoption, without systematic persecution, beliefs changed gradually. Some disappeared, others merged, none dominated by decree. Spirituality was evolution, not rupture. The centuries we call the Dark Ages were different in this world. There was no great cultural collapse. There was fragmentation. Knowledge was not lost at once. It was distributed, more fragile, but also harder to erase. Cities remained important, but none claimed eternity. The concept of empire changed. It no longer meant constant expansion. It meant maintenance. To govern was to sustain, not to grow without limit. Rome was still there, with its hills, with its slow river, with its aging temples, but it no longer dreamed of domination. It dreamed of remaining relevant. Romans no longer defined themselves by conquest. They defined themselves by competence. Good administrators, good engineers, good merchants. Ambition was still alive. It had simply learned to move within a broader framework. In Persian imperial archives, Italy appeared as a stable region, not glorious, not rebellious, predictable. And for an empire, that was the highest praise possible. Over time, the idea of a Rome ruling the world became almost unthinkable, an exercise of imagination, an alternative history. No one wrote. And yet, some thinkers began to ask what might have happened if that Western city had not been contained in time, if its military discipline had been given centuries to perfect itself, if its ambition had found a power vacuum. Those thoughts were never official. They appear in margins, in commentaries, in secondary texts, as warnings, because the empire's greatest achievement was not what it built, it was what it prevented. Asterisk, asterisk, this is not the end of the story, asterisk, because now the world enters another phase, a phase where balance begins to strain, where new powers emerge, where the Persian legacy begins to show cracks, and where the shadow of Rome, though no longer dominant, still projects possibilities. Asterisk, asterisk, the erosion of the Persian order, asterisk, asterisk. No system, no matter how efficient, remains intact forever. The Persian Empire had achieved something extraordinary, a world without a single hegemon, yet not fragmented into permanent chaos. But that balance came at a cost, and that cost was constant vigilance. Unlike empires built on direct conquest, Persia depended on something more fragile: voluntary obedience, not imposed by terror, but sustained by benefits, protection in exchange for tribute, autonomy in exchange for loyalty, order in exchange for predictability. As long as benefits outweighed costs, the system worked. But time always tips the scale. Over centuries, satrapies began to develop their own identities, not rebellious, not yet, but distinct. Local governors, increasingly distant from the center, learned to rule without consulting. Decisions took months to travel, responses even longer. The empire remained vast, but it was no longer immediate. Italy was among the first places where this became evident. Rome, though integrated, remained a dense, educated, organized city. Its elites no longer dreamed of open independence, but of greater room to maneuver. They did not want to break the system. They wanted to influence it. Romans excelled at something Persia had always respected: local administration. They knew how to count, how to record, how to maintain complex infrastructure. Over time, many intermediate imperial posts fell into Roman hands, not through favoritism, through efficiency. Thus began a silent transformation. Rome was no longer a political center, but it became a technical one, a place where bureaucrats, engineers, managers of routes and resources were trained. They did not rule the empire, but they made it function. This created a new tension. Formal power remained in the east. Operational power began to shift. It was not a conspiracy. It was a consequence. At the same time, new threats emerged on the frontiers. Peoples who did not seek integration, tribes that wanted neither tribute nor agreements, mobile, unpredictable groups. The empire, accustomed to negotiation, did not always know how to respond. Its administrative machinery was perfect for managing stability, not for responding to rapid chaos. Every decision had to pass through layers of approval. Every response had to preserve overall balance. That saved the system and slowed it down. In this context, the Roman model, more direct, more rigid, began to look useful, not as ideology, but as a tool. Some satraps began copying Roman practices: harsher discipline, more immediate military response, less negotiation. The empire did not realize it was changing, not through rebellion, but through adaptation. And every adaptation alters essence. In Rome, old republican narratives began circulating again, not as calls for independence, but as historical examples. This is how we resolved crises. This is how we responded to rapid threats. No one spoke of restoring the republic. They spoke of restoring effectiveness. Memory began to work, and memory, once activated, is never neutral. In administrative schools, Roman texts began to be studied alongside Persian and Greek ones, not as relics, As alternative manuals, the world did not need an eternal Rome, but perhaps it needed some of Rome. Meanwhile, the imperial center faced its own problems: complicated successions, internal disputes, distant regions growing ever more autonomous. Nothing collapsed. Everything tightened. The empire remained the dominant order, but it was no longer unquestioned. And that was new. Thinkers of the time began writing about cycles, about empires that do not fall suddenly, but dissolve, about systems so large, no one remembers how they began. Rome observed, patiently, not as conqueror, as potential heir, not heir to power, but to method. The world was entering a different phase, not collapse, transition. And in that transition, old questions returned. Is a flexible order better, or a firm one? Does diversity protect or weaken? Can an empire last if no one fears it? These questions had no immediate answers, but they were preparing everything for what would come next. Asterisk, asterisk. The question that never went away. Asterisk, asterisk. History rarely announces when it enters a new stage. There are no trumpets, no clear signs, only a shared sensation that things no longer work exactly as before. The Persian Empire did not fall. That matters. There was no decisive invasion, no sacked capital, no ending worthy of chronicles. What happened was more subtle. Order began to redistribute. Satrapies acted with greater autonomy. Governors trusted local judgment more than distant decrees. Routes still functioned. Taxes still arrived. But the center no longer dictated the world's pulse. It merely accompanied it. Rome, meanwhile, had changed completely. Without becoming unrecognizable, it remained proud. It still believed in discipline. It still valued structure. But it no longer believed in manifest destiny. It had learned something the old republic never understood. That domination is not always victory. Romans had seen empires from the inside. They had learned how they erode, how they adapt, how they survive, and above all, how they delegate. When the Persian order began to fragment, Rome did not raise banners. Rome did not declare independence. It was the world that began to resemble Rome. A little more. Regions began copying hybrid models. Strong local administration, clear authority, rapid response. Not universal empires, solid regional systems. The idea of a single power lost appeal. Too fragile, too costly, too dependent on exceptional men. The world had learned another lesson. Stability is born not from greatness, but from repetition. Over time, the memory of a conquering Rome became an academic exercise. A what if philosophers debated. Historians imagined, but no one tried to rebuild it because the world no longer needed it. Europe, North Africa, and the Near East developed as a mosaic, with conflicts, with shifting alliances, with brief wars and long treaties. There was no Roman century. There were human centuries. Knowledge traveled more slowly, but it did not disappear. There was no universal dark age. There were regions that shone, while others dimmed. Then the cycle reversed. Religions evolved without an imperial arm. Some died out, others transformed. None conquered the world by decree. Faith was choice, not obligation. And Rome became something unexpected. Not the capital of the world, a reference to how a city could have been everything and learned not to be, a reference of restraint, of limit. Later texts, written centuries afterward, sometimes mention Xerxes, not as conqueror of Greece, but as the king who understood that the greatest enemy is not always the one who raises arms, but the one who has not yet discovered how far he can go. Because Rome did not fall from weakness. It was stopped by anticipation. And that is a rare lesson in history. Most empires die from excess. Rome, in this world, died before being born as an empire, and that changed everything. In the end, the question is not whether this world was better or worse. That is not a historical question. The real question is this: do we need eternal empires to advance, or are systems enough that know when to stop? This alternative history is not about a conquest that never happened. It is about a decision made in time, a silent decision made far from the battlefield. Because sometimes the most decisive act in history is not a war, but preventing it before it becomes inevitable. Good night. Wherever you are, this alternative world now fades away, like all the worlds that never were. But the question remains: how many stories like this have we never known because they were stopped before they began?